Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys every blur effect inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. The only exception to that is the lens blur, because that requires Pro, which I don't have. So we're going to get started with the effects library blurs, then I'll show you blurring on the color page, and finally more advanced blur effects that you can find on the Fusion page of Resolve 16. So if you open up the effects library up here, which is generally open by default, you can go down to OpenFX down here, and you have a category for blurs, which you can drop onto any clip in your timeline. So let's go ahead and get started with the box blur here. So the box blur blurs in rectangular shapes. If you look really closely, you can see kind of a rectangle pattern inside of there. And let's go ahead and move this over to the left side of the screen so it's not in the way. So if we open up the OpenFX controls in the inspector, then we'll be able to adjust these settings. So if we scroll around, you'll see, if you look closely, that they're going to be these lines going across both vertically and horizontally. And depending on the strength I set, at low values, those lines are very visible, but if we increase it to a higher setting, then it becomes almost impossible to see with the naked eye. Also, you can apply this blur multiple times to your effect by increasing the number of iterations. So if you put it at 2, then that means it's going to be applying the same strength horizontally and vertically, but it's going to be doing it twice across the image, which is going to increase the blurriness of the image and smooth it out a little bit. Now there's also this setting called gang here. So with the gang, if you uncheck that, then that is going to mean that the horizontal strength and the vertical strength are unlocked. So with the gang unlocked, you can increase the horizontal strength so that it will be blurring out more in the horizontal direction than the vertical direction, or vice versa. And likewise with vertical strength, you can increase it if you want it to pull more for each of the blurs in the vertical direction. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Directional Blur. So in the effects library, we can drag Directional Blur onto our clip. And the Directional Blur is very simple. So it's going to be blurring at a specific angle. If we increase the blur, we can see this a lot more visibly. So right now it's going at a 45-degree angle. And when it uses that angle, it's blurring in both directions across the line. So when it encounters one of these birds here, it's going to be blurring it out in both directions. If I spin it around by adjusting the blur angle, you can see how everything is being blurred according to that line. And also, to prove that it's doing the same effect but in both directions, we can see that the blur angle of 0 is going to look exactly the same as the blur angle of 180. And that's also why it only goes up to 180, because going 360 degrees would just be completely redundant. So basically you just find your blur angle and adjust the strength to have it be as blurry as you want it to be. Next we have a Gaussian blur. So Gaussian blurs are pretty much the simplest type of blur. It just applies evenly across the entire image. You can adjust the horizontal and vertical strength of it, but you'll see how it applies evenly across the entire image, and it doesn't have any shapes that are visible like with a box blur. You can uncheck the gang once again if you want it to blur more in one direction, but basically it's going to get you a very simple, smooth blur. Now you might also notice that on the edges of this clip, it has a black border. So if we want, we can change that to a different type. So once again, we're skipping over the lens blur simply because it requires the Pro version of Resolve in order to use. And as far as I know, that is the only blur effect that does require Pro. So let's go ahead and move on to Mosiac Blur for now. So Mosiac Blur basically takes your image and pixelates it. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a single pixel for every pixel. Rather, you can set the pixel frequency over here on the OpenFX tab to determine how big those pixels should be. So with an image that obviously is going to have a much higher resolution than the blur, you can basically average the colors together in a region, and that's how you come up with the pixel colors. So of course, the lower your pixel frequency, the more it's going to have to average in order to get those gigantic pixels that appear on the screen. In my opinion, it might be a fun property here, the pixel frequency, to go ahead and animate it if you wanted to create a fun transition. There's also the smoothing here. So if you want to essentially add a Gaussian blur on top of the Mosiac blur so that it's not literal pixels here, but it is actually blurred out a little bit and a little harder to see visibly, then you can increase the smooth strength to some value above 0, just to show that it's basically the same as a Gaussian blur. Let's just go ahead and throw that on here, and you can see the blur with the Gaussian blur at about 0.7 strength, and then the smooth strength at about 0.7. So essentially the same thing. So next we have Radial Blur. So when you do a Radial Blur, there is a center point where it is blurring from, and then it goes in rings away from that center point in order to create the radial effect. So how the radial blur works is that there is a center point in which it's going to be creating blur rings expanding ever outward. Kind of like if you looked at the underside of a CD or a DVD, it's kind of like that. So if we go to OpenFX, there's actually the ability to change the position of where that center point is. So you can see as I adjust the horizontal position, it's actually changing the source point for where those rings are coming from. If we increase the smooth strength, it's going to be much easier to see that. So like we can see it visibly moving here. And then all of these rings just go around in a circle to create the blur. We can also adjust the white position, of course. So similar to that is the zoom blur. The difference with the zoom blur is it doesn't create rings, rather it creates straight rays from that source point. So you can see right here, the source point is there and rays go out straight in every direction away from that point. But just like with the radial blur, we can adjust the position for that center point. So you can see how when I adjust that, that is determining where the rays are originating from. So we can increase the smooth strength if we want a stronger blur, which is going to make it much more obvious. But as long as the center point is on screen, it should be very, very clear where those rays are originating from. And that's the basic blurs that you would find on the edit page for Resolve. So let's go over next to the color grading page, where you're actually able to blur as well. And I'll go ahead and reset all of these settings back to their original values before we get started. And let's go ahead and go to blur here. So blur you find on the 5th tab on this toolbar with the radius value. If you increase it above the center point, then you're going to get a blur, and we can't see the blur because it's not actually connected to the output. So let me do that here with the nodes. Okay, so now we have the blurred out node connected to the output. So you can see as we increase the radius towards 1, it gets much more blurry. And if we decrease it towards 0, we actually get the inverse. We get sharpening of the image, which is going to make the edges very visible with a harsher look to them. And now there's actually 3 pages of controls here. So we have blur right here. There's also horizontal vertical ratio. So if you want it to blur more in one direction, you can increase or decrease this. So horizontal to 1 is going to make it blur horizontally. And then if you decrease it towards 0, it's going to be blurring up down rather than left right. Now there's also 2 other pages here. So if we click over here on the sharpen page, you'll see that the values for radius and HV ratio actually stayed the same. So if we don't set anything else, then it basically serves the same as when we were on the blur controls. So when we're on the sharpness side of radius, below 0.5, and we increase the scaling, you'll see that these white patches created by the sharpness effect become larger and larger. So it's basically scaling the size of the sharpness that applies anywhere on the image and increasing that. So obviously too much of that can be a bad thing. And if you drop it down to 0, then basically you end up with no sharpness whatsoever. And you can see that as I raise or lower the radius. But only below 0.5. If we increase it above 0.5, then we still get the blurriness as before. It's a little confusing because with blur and the sharpen page, you can actually both blur and sharpen the image. Now on the sharpen page, there's also these settings down here at the bottom. So when we have lots of sharpness, and let's just go ahead and do that, the edges of these white blobs that get created can be softened a little bit by increasing the core softness. So you'll see with 0 softness, and I'll zoom in here so it's a little bit clearer. So we can see that with 0 softness and then 100. So there's 2 other settings down here, which is level and coring softness. So when we increase the level towards 100, it's going to have a smaller sharpen effect, but it's also going to be a lot more pixelated, as you can see here. And if we drop it to 0, it's going to be very large on these white areas, but they're going to kind of be more of a glowy blur rather than strictly sharpening the image. And if we put it somewhere in the middle here, then we can also increase the coring softness, which is going to take these edges and soften them once again. So if we increase the coring softness here, you can see how that kind of blurs the edges between the parts that just got sharpened and everything else in the image. So as you increase the level, you can blur those sharpened images a little bit by adding in coring softness. Okay, finally, there is the mist page. So with mist, you get this mix setting. Everything else is the same as before. But then with mix on the mist page, the idea is that you can kind of combine blurring and sharpening at the same time. So if you have it set to mix 100, that is going to be purely sharpen. And if you have it set to 0, it's going to be purely a blur effect. And yes, it will be a blur even if your radius is set down here to 0.19. So if your mix is 0, then a low radius is going to be blurring and a high radius is going to be blurring. And if you have it set to 100, then high radius is going to be blurring, low radius is going to be sharpening. And if you have it set somewhere in the middle, then it's going to give you something in between both sharpening and blurring the image. Honestly, I don't 100% grasp it myself, but if you play around with the sliders, basically you'll get the right combination of sharpening or blurring when you go back through these pages and you play around with the settings. So that's basically the idea there. Let's go over to the Fusion page now, and you'll see that I went ahead and set up nodes for every blur that exists here. So first off, we have the VariBlur. Okay, so before we go to the Fusion page, let's make sure that every other blur in our project is taken off. So I'm disconnecting that blur node and connecting this one to the output. We'll go back to the edit page and make sure this clip has no OpenFX. And now we can go to the Fusion page. So on the Fusion page, I have every blur effect lined up here as a node that you can add in by default. So all of these blurs you would find in right click, add tool, and go to blur. So we're going to start with the VariBlur. And what VariBlur allows you to do is to include a blur image in order to determine basically the output channels for where it should be blurred and where it shouldn't. So that's based on this blur channel over here. Let's go ahead and delete this input so that I can make sure I'm loading the right image here. So we're going to right click, add tool, go to in out and choose loader so that I can add in this blur image I grabbed from GIMP. So I just created it over here very simply. And we're going to feed this to VariBlur. So the difference between this and a standard masking image is that you can use different channels for determining where the blur goes and where it doesn't. So normal masks are just black, white, or some shade of that in between. But with the VariBlur, we can set the blur channel to be something else. So if we set it to red now, you can see how it switches sides, and now it's blurring based on wherever it is very red on the image. And you might have a color that isn't purely red. It could be something like a brown where it has a mix of colors, but it's going to be blurring based on only the reds in that image. Or we set it back to blue, and it's going to be blurring based on only the blues in that image. Green as well is an option, and you can also do the alpha for the image. So this image has 100% alpha. It's a JPEG, so you would have to use a PNG if you wanted to use alpha channel. But there's also luminosities. So based on the brightness of the colors in the screen, you get a blur. So it's basically even here, because if we were to go back here, these have the same luminosity values, but they are different colors. So this is different than all the other blurs because the other blurs only have effect masks. So with effect masks, you can basically tell it directly where it should blur and where it shouldn't based on a shape or black-white channels. But you can't do other channels like red, green, blue, or alpha. Okay, so the next blur type is the simple blur node. So when you're using the blur node, you have a bunch of different filters you can use. So box filter. It's got that rectangular shape that we saw before with the OpenFX box blur. So you can see how everything is little rectangles. If we increase the blur size, then the size of those individual rectangles become much larger, they overlap more, and then the image gets more blurry as a result. So similar to that, there's also multi-box. Pretty much the same thing, except that you have the ability to add on multiple passes. So without multiple passes, it's essentially the same, but as soon as you add on multiple passes, it's going to be rendering another layer of the blur over it. And compared to a normal box blur, it's much harder to actually tell where those boxes are. I would guess that that's because the extra passes are rendered with some kind of offset, so they don't line up straight on top of each other, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So there's also Bartlett Gaussian and Fast Gaussian. So these are basically different algorithms that kind of accomplish the same thing more or less. So you know the Gaussian blur applies evenly across the image, and you can't really see any discernible shapes with the Gaussian blur. There's also Fast Gaussian, which to the naked eye looks exactly the same. And then there's also Bartlett blur. So I can't really see a discernible difference between the three of them. My understanding is it's different algorithms for calculating the blur, but there is a difference in terms of performance. So if I go here and I set it to Gaussian Blur, then we'll hit play and you'll see how it kind of renders the blur, and it's not too bad in terms of the performance. But if we compare that to fast Gaussian and hit play, same thing. The fast Gaussian blur actually renders the blur much faster than the normal Gaussian blur. Bartlett, I find, also gets similar performance to the fast Gaussian blur. Not 100% sure which one is actually faster, but more or less they perform about the same, at least with simple projects like this. So that's about the difference between the 5 different blur filters that you find on the blur node. Aside from that, you can adjust the size of the blur, and that's about it. It's pretty straightforward. So next we have Defocus, which is going to have a blur effect, but coupled with a bloom. So the bloom lighting is going to appear from the brightest areas of the screen already. So in this case, that's kind of up here in this top right area where the sun is still kind of shining its light. So if we increase the bloom level and decrease the threshold, then you'll be able to see that bloom lighting effect kind of covering the background in a lot of extra light. So the lower the bloom level is, the less exaggerated that bloom effect is going to be. And the lower the threshold is, the more is actually going to be considered a candidate for the bloom effect. So you can just adjust those settings where you need them to be. As far as the filter goes, you can either have a Gaussian blur, which is same as before, just kind of applies even across the image that you're blurring. But there's also lens, where you're able to choose a lens shape. So kind of like with the box blur, this is going to have a minor impact over how things look. So you can see it does impact how it looks in the end. You can also increase or decrease the number of lens sides, and you can adjust the angle at which those lenses should be rendering. So just a bunch of sliders that slightly adjust the blur. But really the main difference is the bloom effect. So you're combining a type of a glow with a basic blur as well, which I guess is mostly meant to simulate how a lens would look if it was defocused from whatever it was looking at. Next we have the directional blur, which you could kind of phrase as a bunch of the OpenFX combined into one. So it's going to depend mostly on the type you set here. So the linear is like the regular directional blur. The main difference with the linear type here is that it is going in a singular direction. So if I set the length to -1, it's going to be going in one direction based on where those blur lines are set. But if we do the length of -1, it's going to be doing the inverse. It's going to be going on the opposite direction in that line. But if you want it to look like the regular directional blur, then you can go to centered. So the centered is going to be applying evenly in both directions. So you can see the more I apply the blur, it spreads out across the angle line evenly in both directions. But with type linear, it only blurs in one direction. And you can also see how, because it goes in one direction, it does offset the image a little bit. So the difference between length of -1, the position of that boat there, and then positive 0.1 for the length. It does change the position of the boat in the final render. Okay, so we also have a radial blur. So like before, it is going to make it go around in circles, but rather than just having a simple circle line, it's actually more like a spiral now. So it's going to be warping the base image in a spiral shape, and we can increase the angle the more we want it to warp it out of proportion. If you go to numbers like this, it's pretty much impossible to tell what the actual base value was. So you're probably looking at something more like a value between 0 and 45 in most cases. Also something you could animate for some cool transition effects. And that's about the difference there. So it's in a spiral. Then we also have zoom here. So the difference with the zoom, it still has that spiral shape going away from the center, where it becomes more and more distorted away from the center point. But you can see here that in the center of the zoom that it is actually much clearer than before. So if we go back to radial, then you can see it still blurs the center point. But if we do it in zoom mode, then the center area is going to be left alone a little bit more. So a minor difference there. And also by adjusting the length, these outer areas are going to zoom in a little bit if you have it set to a length of -0.1, or they'll zoom out a little bit if you have it set to a length of 0.1. So in a nutshell, it's just like the radial blur, but it has that factor of zooming depending on which part of the image you're looking at. The center will look a little bit more zoomed in or zoomed out than the edges. So next we have the glow blur, which is going to blend the colors together and make them look a little bit more similar. So if we have a glow of 0, you can see how the colors are a lot more distinctive from each other. But if we increase the glow size towards 100, then the colors become a little bit more similar. So it's just kind of smoothing out the differences between the colors on the screen. So there's obviously a lot of different filters you can use. We won't cover the ones that you find in the standard blur node again. Those are pretty much self-explanatory at this point. But we'll jump to blend. So compared to a standard Gaussian glow, it seems to strip a lot more of the difference in luminosity. So where the sun was shining on the right edge of this image, it's a lot harder to tell that that actually is going on when you add in the blend. And if we brought this all the way to 100, then you would see almost no difference in the luminosity across the skyline there. But compare that with 100 glow Gaussian blur, and you can still see the differences in the lighting there. There's also highlight over here. So with the highlight blur, it's going to leave the darkest parts of the image alone a lot more than the brightest parts. So you can see when I set the glow to 0, everything is back to normal. But as we approach 100, those bright areas on the screen, they become a lot more blended together. But then the darker areas like the boats, the birds in the sky, they're mostly left alone even when we approach 100. So if you wanted to affect the highlight or the brighter areas inside of the screen, but leaving the dark areas, then that would be the one you'd go for. And then we have solarized glow, which actually adds a bit of transparency here. So those bright areas, what would have been the highlights before, are kind of largely stripped out actually. And the darker areas are left more in the image. We still do get a little bit of that glowy blur. But with the solarized effect, I think you would generally want to apply a second image on the back of it. So you'd be blending two images together, because you can see wherever you have this checkered pattern, you're actually having partial transparency on the image. So that would allow anything behind it to show through if you had a second image on another background layer in your main editing timeline. Okay, so next we have the sharpen effect. So pretty much like what you would have seen over on the color page. If you have a sharpen of 0, it's going to not apply sharpening, but as you increase the amount of sharpening, it's going to be taking wherever it finds edges in the image and making them appear even harsher than before. So basically anywhere that is an edge is going to stand out a lot more as you increase the sharpness here. Obviously increasing it too much is going to really distort the original image. So unless you have a good reason, you probably only want a little bit of sharpness in most cases, rather than increasing the sharpness change to something drastic. Okay, so next up we have soft glow. So it's very similar to the glow here, except that wherever the glow is originating from, it is going to spread out across the image in a more even, soft pattern. You'll see that as I raise or lower the threshold here, that the glow areas slowly creep outwards, and it's almost like a gradient because most of the glow comes from those highlight areas, and the glow effect gets a little bit softer as it comes out to these areas which aren't within the threshold. So when something's on the edge of the glow for soft glow, it's only going to have a partial glow to it, which might give you a little bit more of a preferable effect if you do want that soft look. Aside from that, you have a bunch of filters just like before. You can adjust the gain, which is going to increase the base glow value, or you can lower it down if you want it to be less dramatic of a glow. And next we have Unsharp Mask. So with the Unsharp Mask node, we can sharpen the image, but we can also exclude certain parts based on a threshold. So if I increase the threshold to something like 0.15 here, then you can see that the areas which were already kind of similar to whatever surrounds it, like this water here is darker compared to the shadows of the birds here. So it actually fell outside of the threshold and doesn't receive the sharpening. But in these center areas where the areas surrounding the birds are actually much brighter, it still falls within the threshold of what will be sharpened because there is that contrast between the colors. So if we increase the threshold, then only the most contrasted areas are going to still be sharpened. Aside from that, you can increase the size and the gain on the sharpness to get the desired effect, but basically it's sharpness with a threshold. Okay, lastly, we have VectorMotionBlur. So you can see here I connected an optical flow node to the VectorMotionBlur, and that is feeding in as a vector input. So the VectorMotionBlur can take XY channels as values that you pull from something else. So one option is to use a optical flow node. So what the optical flow node will do is look at the frames that are really close to each other and figure out in what direction the pixels, like each individual pixel, seems to be moving, and use that to calculate the movement vector, which we can feed into VectorMotionBlur here. So using an optical flow node is quite GPU intensive, so it will take a while to render, but we can see a side by side here. So we have the media in the original video and then media out over here, and we can hit play here and see it go render these frame by frame. So the idea is it's calculating the direction of the movement by looking at how the pixels change between each frame. So when we look at the rendering with the motion blur, we can see how these objects which are changing the position a lot on the screen with a single frame, basically the things that are really close to the camera like these birds here, are going to be receiving the most blur because those are the objects that are moving the most. So if we go back to frames over here and hit play with these rendered frames, we'll be able to kind of see that a little bit. Just compare the left over here to the right. Let me try to line those up a little better. Okay, so left to right comparison. Let's bring this down a little bit more and hit play. So in the end, wherever you get movement, you get a blur. And that's basically done by calculating where the movement is with the optical flow node. That's about as good as I can explain it at the moment anyway. Hopefully that makes sense. So going through the vector motion blur effect actually reminded me there is a more basic motion blur that exists in Resolve. So when you are editing 3D text effects or creating your own, you may run into a setting. And we'll go ahead and drop one in here. So let's do 3-line drop here. Okay, yeah, this will do nicely. So if you want to get a motion blur based on text movement, you don't need to hook it up to a vector motion blur node. What you can actually do is you can just go into the text and you'll find a motion blur setting here. So if you play it with the text, because it takes a long time to render, let's take the motion blur off of the background node. So it's just going to be media in to media out now, no extra blur. And now we can come take a look at this title. We can hit play and we can see the title by its default. So that has no blur attached to it. But if you want motion blur, you can click on the title, find the text controls. Usually these will be exposed, so you can check motion blur and you have some quality settings depending on how much motion blur you want, the angle of that blur. You can set that there. We can also check motion blur for the other text controls. And now if we go ahead and hit play, you'll see the text title has a motion blur effect, which is super cool. It takes a little longer to render, but it's really easy to add on to text effects. So final bit here for this video, if you wanted to go and find motion blur on a title that you've added in, then you can find the text plus element. You can double click to expand it if it is closed here. Go to the settings page on the far right here and you'll find motion blur here. I can also show that for a new title that you want to create from scratch, if you click text plus, it'll be over here once again on the settings page. So you just check motion blur. But what I've seen as a notable difference is that if you do 3D blurs, although there should definitely be setups where you can create a motion blur effect, if you click on text 3D and you expand it, although it is mostly the same as a standard text plus element, if you go over to the final page, you won't see motion blur listed here. So I guess you don't have access to that really simple 2D motion blurring effect. So just one more minor thing to consider if you don't actually need your text to move in a 3D scene, but rather just using a simpler 2D text node. So that's pretty much going to be it for this video on every blur effect inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. I hope you guys learned a lot from this video. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.